Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Lin Jiang and I are old Tongxue. We were both at the College of Foreign Affairs in Beijing in 1995. I can't say we knew each other then. That was probably good for him. He didn't know me. I was a troublemaker. So that's probably just as well. It was a good thing he wasn't in my class because he would have had difficult choices to make. That would have been good. And it's an honor to be in Singapore, though. I've been to Singapore before, but never as frequently as I would like, because it's a beautiful, wonderful place to visit. It's an honor to be back. This is the first time I've had the honor of being a distinguished speaker, so it's a special honor this time. If you can't see me because of the microphone, you let me know. What I would like to do today is talk about the United States and Asia. United States and East Asia. I want to do four things. I want to ask, what is the U.S. strategic interest in East Asia? Second, what does pursuing this strategic interest require for the United States and East Asia? Third, how does the United States go about pursuing that strategic objective? And finally, what are the prospects as we look forward for American security interests in East Asia as we watch the rise of China? Now, let me begin with that first question. What are U.S. strategic interests in East Asia? That's really a very simple answer. America has the same interest in East Asia, precisely, as we have in Europe. Both those regions, since the beginning of the United States, almost 240 years ago, the U.S. interest was to have a divided flank, divided regions on either side of the United States. So we think of America as looking toward Europe. Well, that's fine. We look toward Europe if you live in New York. If you live in Los Angeles, you look toward Asia. And so in that respect, Asia is just as important to America as Europe. No difference whatsoever. Equally important. And you can see the importance of a divided flank for American security if you take just a brief look at American security policy and American diplomacy since 1776, when we declared our young nation's independence. No, more than 50 years, though, yes, but not as long as time. 1776, in the early years of the Republic, every major security development in U.S. diplomatic history reflected the impact of a divided Europe. The United States was a small state. We all know the American national anthem, fighting a war. But if you listen to the words carefully, we're the small state, fighting a great power, Britain. The words go, the flag's still there. Throughout this history, for the early years of the Republic, the United States was a small power whose security depended on great power rivalry. 1776. The critical battle of the American Revolution was the Battle of Yorktown. And British troops, fighting American troops, needed resupplies to fight the war. The French Navy was out there preventing them from landing their ships to resupply the American guerrillas. 1794, we won the war against the British, but the British wouldn't pull their troops out of America. They still had bases in America at the U.S.-Canadian border. When did we finally get them out? In 1794, because the Napoleonic War was going on, and Britain couldn't afford to risk war with the United States when they were fighting Napoleon. And so they agreed to leave. The next major incident is the Spanish controlled the Mississippi River. And they wouldn't let American ships go up and down the Mississippi. America finally got navigation rights up and down the Mississippi River, again during the Napoleonic Wars, when the Spanish were afraid that the British would attack them for cooperating with Napoleon. And of course the War of 1812. I'm sorry, I skipped a step. The Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon needed money to fight the British. So he sold us a piece of territory that was more than twice the size of what America was before then, at a good price. 1812, we're fighting the British. We're losing against the British. We lose the war in the Battle of New Orleans. But the British sued for peace because Napoleon had come out of exile. And they had to pull their navy out of Napoleon. Even the American Civil War, the French wanted to intervene in the American Civil War. Why? Because they couldn't get Southern cotton. The absence of Southern cotton was killing the French economy. And the American Confederate States are going to Paris saying, support us, align with us. The French keep saying, well, we're not sure. Why weren't they sure? Because they thought if they went to war against the North, without British going in, the British would use the French war against the North to weaken the French. Ultimately, the French said no, because they were afraid of British opportunity. So what changed? Well, it's very simple what changed. If you look at the history of Europe, Europe could no longer keep itself divided. Germany was getting too strong, and Europe was going to come under the control of one country, and the other European powers couldn't keep it divided. So what did the U.S. say? We'll do it ourselves. The first time was World War I. We go in, help defeat the rising power Germany. Next time, World War II, we got to go back in again. Germany's going to win and take over the entire continent. This time we stayed in Europe. Why? Because the Cold War is no different. The Cold War was, well, some other country is going to dominate our flank, and that was the Soviet Union. This time we stayed in Europe to keep Europe divided. So our strategic interest in Europe is no different during the Cold War, or even after the Cold War, than it was in 1776. The question the United States faces today is, do we need to still be in Europe to keep it divided? We don't really know the answer to that. The Russians are much weaker than the Soviet Union. Germany's united again. And of course, you'll hear American defense specialists say, Germany, start spending money on defense. You can do this by yourself. France, time to wake up and spend money on defense. We shouldn't be doing this for you. There's a lot of truth to that. Many Americans feel we don't need to be there. Russia's weak, Germany's united, French are strong, you do it. So maybe we can leave again. Maybe Europe today looks like Europe in the 1880s. A lot of countries of relatively equal weight. We don't need to be there. So the point was, as long as the region's divided in Europe, no European power can say, now we've conquered Europe, we have no enemy, time to cross the Atlantic. And that's what frightens them. If a great power dominated Europe, they could then become a naval power crossing the Atlantic. It doesn't sound like a real possibility, but remember, the British were there once. The Germans were in Mexico. That's what we worried about. World War II, we were concerned. Well, East Asia is no different. Not at all. Our fundamental interest in East Asia. That's called balance of power politics. As long as we have a distribution of power among the great powers in East Asia, no East Asian great power, and then say, now that I've conquered Asia, let's look at the Western. Now, you might think that's a silly concern of the United States, but we need to remember, during World War II, California had a curfew. All lights off at night. California was afraid of a Japanese bomber attack. So America is consistently worried about, when we look at East Asia, keep that region divided, so great powers in that region stay in that region instead of cross the Pacific. Now, when before America entered the Pacific, the colonial powers kept themselves divided. The French were here, the Germans were here, the Japanese were here. And there was competition among these powers. But then, the rise of Germany, after World War I, a second rise, third rise, they all brought their troops home. Actually, it began before World War I. The Anglo-Japanese Treaty of 1902 Japan says we can't compete with Germany and have a naval presence in Asia. We're going to have to compromise with Japan. And what Great Britain was essentially saying was, Japan, we're going to give you Northeast Asia. We're going to stop competing. We're going to bring our ships home because we got to deal with the French, the Russian, and the German navies. And then with World War, between the wars, the French and the Germans. So there was no one in East Asia to check Japanese. Japan wasn't a great, strong power, but it was a lot stronger than everyone else. For long, the threat existed that Japan would dominate East Asia. So take a look at American policy. Japan takes over the Korean Peninsula. What does America think? We really don't care. Japan moves into China. Well, we sort of feel sorry for the Chinese. We really don't care. Japan moves into Indochina and Southeast Asia, we begin to march toward war. Because it's one thing to control the mainland. Another thing to control the mainland and the maritime regions. That's the whole region. Believe me, Roosevelt knew he was marching because he was opposing the Japanese expansion. The Cold War in Asia was no different. Prevent the region from falling under the control of hostile powers. And what was it? The Sino-Soviet alliance will control Asia. So America goes into Asia and says, no, Asia can't keep itself divided. We will do it for it. So that no country in Asia can dominate the region across the Western Pacific. And of course, after the Vietnam War, we no longer oppose the Sino-Soviet alliance. We just oppose the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union, this was the Nixon visit. This is balance of power politics. So we can cooperate with China to prevent the Soviet Union from dominating Asia. And we relied to a considerable extent on the Sino-Soviet conflict so that neither could focus and get strong. What about contemporary East Asia? Well, if we look at contemporary Europe, we're not sure if we need to stay. Maybe United Germany can do it. French help. Good old-fashioned European balance of politics. We don't say that about Asia. America knows very well that if we don't stay in Asia, rising China will control. Very often. There is no other great power in Asia. That's an Asian great power that can balance the rising China. Russia's not. Russia and the Far East, they have no roads. They have no electricity. They have no air. They have no people. The Russian population in the Russian Far East has gone from 14 million to about 8 million at the end of the Cold War. And guess who left? All the young people. So who's there? Older people, poorly educated, and that's about it. And what's the most dynamic presence in the Russian Far East? Well, of course, it's the Chinese, not the Russians. So the Russians aren't going to help America balance China. Neither will the Japanese. Because I think we all know, if we speak honestly, Japan is a declining power. Japan is declining faster than China's rising. Take a look at the Japanese population. This is fairly obvious. In about 20 years, more or less, the population of Japan will be about the population of Vietnam. Maybe a little more than the population of a unified. Does anyone think that Korea is a great power when it's unified? You can't do it. You're dealing with 1.4 billion Chinese. 100 million, 95 million Japanese. Meanwhile, their economy is still a disaster. Abe economics have failed. Their immigration policy continues to undermine their economic capabilities. And right across the Sea of Japan is the country growing 5%, 4%, 7%. You say what you want about China. But it's a lot faster in Japan. And their defense budget is growing a lot. There's only one country that can keep Asia divided. We know that. So American policy, since the end of the Cold War, has been stay in Asia to keep the region divided in the context of a rising China. policy is the same for Europe since 1776. Same for East Asia since, well, the beginning of time, since the colonial powers discovered Asia. And in both cases, the United States had to step in to do it itself. Now, what does a divided region require? Let's compare Europe and Asia. When the United States stepped in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War to keep Europe divided, what did we do? We brought our ground troops in to occupy Western Europe. We fought World War I in Western Europe with our army. We fought World War II against Germany with our ground troops in Western Europe. We fought the Cold War with a massive U.S. ground force presence in Western Europe. To keep Europe divided, the United States had to maintain a robust, strong military presence inside the country on the peninsula. Why? Because there was nowhere else to go. The only maritime ally the United States could find in all of Europe was Great Britain. But Great Britain had two problems. One, it was too small to allow a sufficient military presence to deal with a continental country that dominated. So if some great power took over all of Europe and America's just sitting there in Great Britain, insufficient to deal with that kind of continental great power. And second, where's Britain located? Way up there in the north. So the rest of Europe is very difficult to manage just from Great Britain. The United States had to be on the mainland in order to balance and keep the region divided. And so you got the Cold War, with U.S. forces right next to Soviet forces in Germany. Now, in East Asia, America's interest is precisely the same, but the requirements are different. Why? For the very simple reason that the geography is different. In the age of missiles, nuclear weapons, cyber warfare, satellites, geography still matters. And the geography of Asia means that there are different requirements to keep the region divided. Look at East Asia. All around the mainland littoral, all around the coastal regions of the mainland, there are large island territories that have two characteristics that Europe never had. One, they're large, and there are a lot of them, so you can have a lot of presence in Asia on maritime territories, which you couldn't do in Europe because England was too small. And second, they're everywhere. It's just not in Northeast Asia with Japan. It's Northeast Asia down to Japan, down to the Philippines, through Indonesia, Borneo, into Singapore, and through into Malaysia. So you have an island maritime geopolitical presence that enables a maritime presence to keep the region divided. It enables a maritime power to contain a mainland power from maritime regions. How do we know this? Well, first of all, January 1950. January 1950, the Cold War is waging in Europe, and the Chinese Communist Party has already taken over China. And Dean Acheson, our Secretary of State, gives a speech, January 1950, and he says, where is America's defensive line in East Asia? What do we care about? He says, the line for us is Japan, the Philippines, and by extension, South China Sea. What did he leave out? He left out Korea. Why? Because it didn't matter. He left out Taiwan. Why? Because it didn't matter. He left out Indochina. Why? Because it just didn't matter. Here we were building up a massive ground force presence in Europe, but simultaneously saying, we're only going to be in the water. Because we understood you had to have a massive land force presence in Europe, but in East Asia it wasn't necessary. So you ask, well, why'd you fight a war in Korea? We fought a war in Korea because communist expansionism went to war in Korea. And And we could not allow communist expansionism to go to war whenever it wanted. We had to stop them. Right? This is a lesson from Munich. You must stop expansionism every time it happens. Well, it just so happened the first place the communists went to war was Korea. So we went to war in Korea. Now, we know it's different. Because what is American policy about North Korea, South Korea? It's very clear. American policy says peaceful resolution, or maybe peaceful unification. Well, Chinese once said, that's a very strange policy. You don't care who wins. It's true. We don't care who wins. If the South Korean people want to run around showing their great loyalty to Kim Jong-un, you go right ahead. We don't care. But it better be peaceful. Because if North Korea goes to war against South Korea, they're now challenging a 50-year commitment to America to defend South Korea. That's an American ally. We'll go to war. But if it's peaceful, we can accept that. The United States never said that about France during the Cold War. France wanted to join the Warsaw Pact? No. We'll occupy France. West Germany wants to join East Germany? No. Our occupying forces in West Germany make sure that never happens. Remember Henry Kissinger dealing with Euro-communism in Italy? Very peaceful process. Communist Party coming to power through votes. Unacceptable for NATO. Why? Because they were vital pieces of territory. South Korea is not. We don't care who wins. Taiwan. Why did we end up protecting Taiwan? Because China attacked North Korea attacked China. Excuse me. North Korea attacked South Korea with Chinese support. Well, now we're fighting Chinese. We're not going to allow you to take over Taiwan. And what do we end up with? A commitment to defend Taiwan. And what is their policy on Taiwan? It's a very strange policy. Peaceful resolution. We don't care who wins. If the people on Taiwan want to run around carrying Mao's little red book, you go right ahead. But it better be peaceful, because the mainland attacks Taiwan. And we don't even care why. You could have Chen Shui-bian declare independence. You attack Taiwan, we'll be at war. But if the people in Taiwan want to become a province governed with China with the PLA on top, go ahead. We don't care. So these are credibility issues, credibility interests on the Korean Peninsula, on Taiwan. Not material interests reflecting the intrinsic importance of the real estate of Taiwan or the Korean Peninsula. And of course the same was true of Vietnam and Indochina. The domino theory was not a theory of Chinese expansionism with Chinese guerrilla armies spreading out all throughout Asia. It was if America were to lose an ally and show its lack of resolve to resist communism, other countries would doubt American will and would change sides. That's called credibility. And of course the great tragedy of the Vietnam War is we lost the war and it didn't matter. It just didn't. And even we lost dominoes. Cambodia fell, Laos fell, and Thailand fell. Right? Saigon fell, and the Thais were on the next plane to Beijing saying, we're now your friends. Didn't matter. Dean Ashton was right in January 1950. Japan, the Philippines, and the South China Sea. Well, now the challenge is maintaining that defensive perimeter, maintaining those maritime interests, maintaining thus a divided region in the context of a rising China. And the question is, how do we do that today? What we need is a divided region. How do we do it? We do it by having a maritime presence. But then the next question is, how are we going about it? What are the policies that we're developing? Well, let's say there are two. We have strategic accommodation and strategic containment. And we're doing both. First, let's talk about strategic accommodation. The rise of China is a reality. you're Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, you're watching the great powers compete. And you're asking yourself, not who we like and don't like, you're saying, which is the more powerful of these two countries, and how do we adjust if one power is getting stronger than another? The small powers are all the same unless they show some dysfunctional behavior. They will adjust by moving from one side to the other. Because if you don't accommodate the more powerful country, you can die. Because if you pick a fight with a more powerful country and they decide to punish you, you're dead. Cambodia almost died, Iraq died, Iran almost died, Kuwait died. These countries picked fights with the wrong country and they got into trouble. So that's what small countries do most of the time. They figure out what's going on. And so with the rise of China, some countries have already begun in East Asia to say, China's rising and we have to begin to appease, would be the old 19th century word. And the question is, what does America do? Well, with those countries that are beginning to accommodate China, there are two of them. We said, okay, we're not going to fight it. Because those countries don't matter. And that would be South Korea and Taiwan. Now, it's not surprising that those two countries, so Taiwan being something we can't call it a country, they are the two new countries that are beginning to feel Chinese power because they're the closest to China. So it's easier for China to rise right in its immediate neighborhood. And they're beginning to say, I don't know if America can be as protective of us as it used to be, because China's getting stronger compared to the United States. So where do we see this? Taiwan? Very clear. The growing shadow of Chinese military power has changed Taiwan. We see this in a few ways. You can find the key year. Key year is 2005. March 2005. It's after the February 2005, I think it was the February 2005 election. Or was it the October 2005 election? It was after the October 2004 election when Chen Shui-bian won. No, it was in 2004. What year was that?
2005, that's right.
February 2005, Chen Shui-bian won the election. We all know he cheated, right? Those two bullets. Remember those two bullets? Yes, we all know he cheated. The next month, Lian Zhan, the former president, goes to Beijing. And he drinks tea and wine with the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. And he goes to Peking University. And he says, it's so good to be back in China. Pretty much says that. And he comes home with an over 60% approval rating from the Taiwan people. They were scared of Chen Shui-bian. And they said, we got to figure out how to get along with the mainland. And this obvious appeasement by the leader of the Kuomintang was welcomed by the people on Taiwan. Then what happened? In 2008, who did the Taiwan people elect but Ma Ying-jeou? And what did Ma Ying-jeou say? He said two things. He said, as a matter of policy, I reject independence. And then he said, as for unification, what is the way in the future? But my personal preference, not a policy, but my personal preference is hopefully one day we can reunify. And he won in a landslide with 63% of the vote. And then, after fundamentally transforming cross-strait relations with cross-strait flights, cross-strait shipping, everything else, he won re-election in 2012. That's the rise of China. And what's the U.S. response? We supported Ma Ying-jeou. We told them, go improve political relations with the mainland. Go improve economic ties with the mainland. And we haven't resisted this at all. And that's telling the mainland, all right, we can accept your rise. We can accept your growing authority over Taiwan. We're not going to fight you. It's okay. And so if you look at the U.S. pivot to East Asia beginning in 2010, you never heard the word Taiwan mentioned once. America has basically resigned itself that Taiwan is a wasting asset for U.S. defense policy because it's just getting too close to China, and nothing can stop that. You see similar trends, somewhat slower, with South Korea. Now, with the mainland, it's clear. What do we have? We have 1,500 mainland medium-range ballistic missiles, Su-27s and Su-30s. They can all fly across the Taiwan Strait, and there's nothing America can do. We might win the war, say, back in 2005, 2008, but Taiwan is destroyed. The rise of China meant that we can't defend Taiwan against the cost of war. And anti-ballistic missile defense just doesn't work. Well, with Korea, it's a whole different issue. Korea, they don't care about Su-27s, and they don't care about Su-30s, and they don't care about, medium-range ballistic missiles. They care about the 2 million PLA ground force. Oh, that's what they care about. Because this is, if you're in Singapore, you can't read anything about the Chinese army. No one cares about the Chinese army in Singapore. If you're in Mongolia, you don't care about the Chinese Navy. All you care about the Chinese army. And that's what South Korea is. They don't care about Chinese Navy. They got Northeast China sitting there with 400 million people, with an advanced infrastructure, an advanced economy, with a PLA ground force that's been modernizing for 30 years, with advanced training, advanced equipment, advanced communication. And it's quite clear, since the beginning of the 21st century, that American ability to contend with the Chinese army on the Korean Peninsula is deteriorating. It's just, this is a more capable army. So for South Korea, that's going to make you nervous. But South Korea's got a second problem. We all will acknowledge that China is very sensitive about North Korea. Because North Korea is a Chinese buffer state. All right, we all know that. But North Korea is also a South Korean buffer state. There's no South Korean border with China. There's just basically cold, mountainous, underdeveloped land. So that's good for South Korea. But the day there's unification is the day that South Korea is now Korea. And the capital is at Seoul, and it has a common border with 1.4 billion Chinese people. And just like in a stock market where you anticipate future trends, South Korea has to anticipate unification because it could fall tomorrow. Look at the news the last few days about North Korea. Where's Kim Jong-un? We don't know where he is, right? What's going on, right? Soviet Union felt like that. We don't expect that, but it could happen tomorrow. And the day it happens, the strategic environment of Korea looks no different than the strategic environment of Vietnam. Population is about the same size, territory is about the same size, and they both have a border with China of 1.4 billion people with a modern Chinese army. You better start being nice to China. Right? And then finally, when the collapse of the Soviet Union, China dominates North Korea. The Soviet Union's gone home, no more competition between China and the Soviet Union for influence. What does that mean? That means that China controls North Korea. Not very well, but enough. So that if you want to control North Korea, if you're South Korea, you be nice to China. Because the way you get peace is only now, in part, from the American deterrent. The other part is, be nice to China and they'll control North Korea. So for all these reasons, you begin to see South Korea change. And they have changed. For example, the United States has a policy around the world, began about 5-10 years ago, called the flexible strategy. Well, during the Cold War, we had troops in, let's say Germany. What were they there for? Defend Germany. We have troops in Korea. What were they there for? Defend Korea. But then we began to say, in the era of rapid deployment and technology and so on and so forth, our troops around the world can be moved anywhere at any time to fight contingencies wherever they might occur. And so we went around to our allies. We said, let's start talking about how we can use American presence in your country and your facilities to enable the United States to carry out operations elsewhere. So, of course, in Europe, we call this out-of-area cooperation. Well, we returned to South Korea. We got all these forces and naval bases and ground force bases. Let's talk about our flexible strategy. And South Korea said no. Because they knew what that meant. That meant that South Korean territory and U.S. forces on South Korea would be used to fight a war against China. They said, no. These forces are there to fight North Korea. We will not cooperate with you to fight a war against China. And it still hasn't happened to this day. Missile defense. We're developing missile defense with Japan, talking about it with Australia. South Korea says, no, we're not doing missile defense with you. Because you can say however much you want that American missile defense is aimed at North Korea. Nonsense. When American officials get into the room with the Japanese and they shut the doors, they say, Japan needs missile defense. Look at all the missiles aimed at you. And they're all from China, with a couple from North Korea. That's how we justify it. South Korea says, no. Well, you know, South Korea, we would like to have greater alliance cooperation and have U.S., Japan, South Korean alliance cooperation. Japan says no. We're not going to cooperate with Japan in military operations as long as Japan and China are adversaries. Will not be on the side of Japan cooperating in the military exercise. And of course, most recently, Japan and China are 100% agreement that Prime Minister Abe is a problem. What's the U.S. response? Fairly minimal resistance. Do you hear us criticizing South Korea? No. Do you hear us saying South Korea has to help America deal with China? No. We kind of got the picture that the rise of China is changing South Korean thinking, and there's not much we can do about it. Indeed, we've tried to almost expedite this process. We've told South Korea that we would like to hand over operational command of South Korean forces during wartime back to South Korea. We don't want to be our three-star, be responsible for your forces and commanding your forces. You do it yourself. This is not a country, the United States, which is trying to keep an ally when we do that. We're saying you can be more independent. And of course, it's true. They don't need our help. Right? The day North Korea invades South Korea is the day North Korea dies. Right? They don't have any food, they don't have any weapons, right? They don't need our help. So we're saying, do it yourself. And they say, right? But that's not a country trying to keep an ally close. The United States is basically prepared to lose its ground force presence in South Korea. We know when unification comes that we're gone. Not going to happen. And we've accepted that. Why? Well, South Korea just doesn't matter. This is a credibility issue, not a geopolitical importance issue. We made clear we're not going to cooperate with South Korea to balance the rise of China. That's not what our objectives are. Nothing matters as long as it's peaceful. So that's the strategic engagement. And that's a fairly constructive policy. Rise of China, we're not going to contain you, we will accommodate you, we're not going to try and block your vital interests. We're trying to engage China so as to make that rising power process easier. And we can do that because it's not very expensive. These countries aren't important to us. But there's also a strong element of American strategic containment. Now, let's remember what the word containment means. Containment means you stay where you are, and we stay where we are. Every status quo power is a containing power. By definition, containment is the policy of a status quo power. Now, I can say that because I don't work in the State Department. It's a bad word. But let's, as academics, as intellectuals in a university, containment just means I want to keep what I got, and you get to keep what you got. And this line between us, who's on whose side in East Asia, who's got spheres of influence, it just can't change. That's called containment. Now, where Where is America containing? We're containing where it matters. We may compromise on Taiwan, we may compromise on South Korea, but we're not compromising in maritime East Asia. That is the prerequisite to maintaining a divided region, and that's ours. We're going to keep it. And that China, you can be out there in the mainland, we'll give you Taiwan, we'll give you South Korea. But we're going to compete to keep maritime Asia. And how do we do it? Well, the classics of international politics tell us there are only two ways that countries do balance the power. Two ways. Internal balancing and external balancing. And we're doing both. So let's first look at internal balancing. Let's look at the American defense budget. Okay? And our technology development, defense technology. Now, before 9/11, if you worked in the Pentagon and you were a good bureaucrat and you wanted to increase your office's budget, you wanted more money out of the defense budget, you had only one word to say: China. And you got more money. And if you didn't say China, you didn't get any money. Because until 9/11, there was only one reason to have a defense budget, and that was China. And we used to say that China, it was a budget driver. That's how you got more money for the Defense Department, as you said China. So before 9/11, China was already on our mind, right? Before 2001. And what happened after 9/11? Well, people don't really focus on this. But how do we fund the war in Afghanistan? How do we fund the war in Iraq? With quarterly supplemental budgets funded by Congress. So the Pentagon made a deal with Congress. All right, we'll fight your war in Afghanistan. We'll fight your war in Iraq, but you have to give us extra money to do this because we don't want to take money from other programs. No sacrifices. No, this is America. We don't sacrifice. We have enough money for everyone. Right? So we're not going to sacrifice this or this or this. Just give us more money. Congress said yes. So that regular annual defense budget was not affected at all. No, I shouldn't say that. Mostly not affected by Afghanistan and Iraq. And so what was it doing? All China all the time. Because we were funding these other two wars with the quarterly supplemental budget from Congress. So the budget was continuing to be focused on China and going up every year. And what do we do? What do we spend money on? F-22s? We weren't building F-22s for Afghanistan. We weren't building F-22s for Iraq, for terrorists. You go to Congress and you say, I need F-22s. They say, why? And you say, China. Huh? F-35s. We're not doing F-35s to deal with Iraq. This is a next-generation fighter to deal with our military competitor. That's called China. The littoral combat ship. Where is the littoral? It starts in North Korea, South Korea, and ends in Malaysia. This was a boat designed for the South China Sea. We're building new aircraft carrier, new generation, the Ford-class carrier. How do you make a justification for an aircraft carrier? You say Western Pacific, you say China. This is a budget and an acquisition policy that is focused on China and doing a lot. And how about our research and development, our technological development? Unmanned ships, laser weapons, another word for directed energy weapons, rail guns, underwater unmanned vehicles, carrier-launched, ship-launched UAVs. This is all China. This is really high-tech stuff. And we're doing a good job. Taking the most advanced technology, putting it into use for weapon systems to deal with the rise of China. That's what it's all about. And the second thing we do with internal balancing is forward deployment. And that's Guam. Guam is an American territory. And our forward deployment at Guam is massive. When did it begin? Well, you can pick the date. It began in March 1996. No. More or less. Yes, March 1996. March 1996 is when the Chinese started shelling the waters near Taiwan. That's when we had our Taiwan Strait confrontation. Now, some of you with a little memory will remember we used to have a debate in Washington about a blue team and a red team. Where did this debate come from? The red team, the anti-China team, came from the Taiwan Strait confrontation of March 1996. Why? Because all of a sudden America said, oh my God, we might fight a war with China. Now, maybe it's going to be Taiwan's fault because they declare independence, but it doesn't really matter. We might fight a war with China. And the Pentagon gears up, thinking about how you want to fight that war. And then, 2 years later, the Pentagon says, time to move things out of Europe and into Asia. And then the next year, in 2000, we moved the first Los Angeles-class submarine out of Europe to Guam. And from that date on, everything has gone into Guam. Excuse me if I read, it's a long list. F-15s go to Guam, F-16s go to Guam, F-22s, first place they went, Japan, now they're in Guam. Los Angeles-class submarines, Virginia-class submarines, B-1 bombers, B-2 bombers, cruise missile stockpiling, and a command and control center for wartime, all go to Guam. This is a massive, people used to joke there's no room left on Guam. It's true. It's just one big military presence, and that's about China. But simultaneously, the United States has been working hard on external balancing. What do we call that? Alliances and strategic partnerships. When did this begin? Well, this began in 1993, actually. Those of you who want to think back, China's economic boom began after the third plenum. We led the Central Committee in December of 1978. But then there was an economic crisis in 89, 90, 91. In 1992, China took off again. There was a China boom. The China threat idea began at this time. And what did the United States do? We have to strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance. So now we're renegotiating defense guidelines with Japan, but the first time we did this was 1993, finished them in 94, signed them in 96. So, rise of China, what are we doing? We're strengthening our alliances. And what are we doing now? We're in the middle of the second round of U.S.-Japan negotiations on revised guidelines for the U.S.-Japan alliance. Rise of China, strengthen your alliances. What else do we do next? Oh, that nice naval facility over at Changi. Work with Singapore very closely in the construction of the Changi facility so it would be capable of taking a 100,000-ton U.S. aircraft carrier. We worked closely. And when it opened, the U.S. Admiral was there for the opening ceremonies. And just recently, we're continuing to expand cooperation with Singapore with expanded joint aircraft, air exercises, naval exercises. Keeps on going. And of course, a little combat ship. First place it goes, Singapore. Australia. Since the middle of the 2000s, we have worked really closely with Australia to expand our satellite stations in northern Australia. They have two purposes. One is satellite intercepted communications, and if you read the media would say, we built all these expensive ground stations in northern Australia to intercept terrorist communication. Nonsense. There's not enough of that chatter out there. This is to intercept Chinese communication. And the second thing is these same ground stations in northern Australia and western Australia, northwest Australia, are there to enable communication between American naval vessels at sea to enable wartime operations. Enhance American satellite communication of our naval operations. 2011, we reached this agreement for a rotation of 250 Marines from Northern Australia at Darwin with the agreement to go to 2,500 permanent. And in 2014, we reached agreement with Australia to provide the facilities and the forced posture agreement to go to that 2,500. And we've also, in 2014, expanded our satellite cooperation. And in 2011, I think it was, yes, in 2011, in a very sensitive subject, we began conversations with Australia to allow American naval access to Cocos Islands. Where are Cocos Islands? Well, we're getting worried about Chinese power, missile capabilities. We'd like to have a little offshore, outside the South China Sea. Well, look at it. It's just south of Jakarta, basically. So you can operate south of Indonesia and have operations inside the South China Sea. But when this leaked to the press, we were talking about Indonesia wasn't happy. No one talks about it anymore. What our militaries are talking about. Philippines. 2011, since the closing of Subic Bay, we finally got an aircraft carrier back into the Philippines. And now we have American forces being able to live inside Philippine bases. First time we've had a ground force presence in the Philippines since the closing of our bases of Clark and Subic with Mount Pinatubo. You can't ask for a more robust American response to the rise of China. We're doing everything possible. Why? Because these alliances are critical to America to be an Asian power. We need to have alliances that have forward presence, and that forward presence is critical to keep the region divided. And I would say so far we're being successful. Why? Well, it's pretty obvious. They're cooperating more with us. Unlike Taiwan, unlike South Korea, they're saying, okay, we'll cooperate more with you. So they must feel that China's not catching up enough to make them worry about cooperating with America. Now let me finish by talking about the prospects. I don't know, I can't read the future, but let's try and think about it here. Can the U.S. keep the region divided? Well, not only U.S. security depends on this, but war and peace depends on this. Because if you want to think about when these big wars in history are fought, they're fought when that gap really gets really closing, and the regions begin to change, and the great powers get nervous. So this is an important issue for the fate of Asia. I'm pretty confident. One, China will close the gap. No, sorry. China will narrow the gap. This is clear. They're going to get more power relative to the United States. This is, inevitable. We're going to be able to wage war against the United States, and it will be a dangerous war. It will be a costly war. But great power relations are always difficult. This will become more competitive. This will become tense. But great power relations are competitive and tense. We're used to thinking in the last 25 years are normal. They're not normal. The last 25 years were unusual. Most times in history, great power relations are just really tense and really difficult. And this is going to be difficult to accept that China closes the gap and it gets more competitive. But it's also something we should expect and prepare for and not see it as a threat to America or the region. Rather, the issue is, can the United States maintain sufficient naval advantage to prevent our alliances from drifting away from us, to reduce our forward presence? And I'm optimistic on this, which is a key issue, for a number of reasons. One is economics. I think we should all understand the Chinese economic system today is deeply, deeply troubled. Debt is 200% of GDP, and debt is growing faster than GDP, about twice as fast, maybe 3 times as fast. What is China's growth rate? They say 7. I don't know, most people say 5. Manufacturing is pretty stagnant, might be less. What's America's growth rate? Well, in the first 3 quarters of this year, over 4%. 4% and 5%, it's not that different. So that pace of change is going to start slowing as China's economy grows slower, and America seems to be doing better. Now, that real number, let's say, doesn't matter, it's 5% or 7%. Yes, it matters. Because it matters for the actual growth of the economy affects Chinese central revenue from tax collection. If you're only growing at 5%, I don't care if you say 7, your tax collection is only going to be 5%. So one of the things to look out for is they say they're growing at 7, but how quickly is budget revenue growing? It's been growing slower than 7%. So That has implications for the ability to spend money on defense. Now, this is a highly dysfunctional Chinese economy on top of it. This is an investment-dependent growth. As I said before, 200% debt, with debt growing faster than GDP, about twice as fast, maybe 3 times as fast. It will be difficult for China to reset it. It's just very hard, without going into why. Except in order to reset this investment, you're going to have to grow at maybe 2% or 3%. And we all know that's really hard for the Chinese Communist Party to accept. And so one would expect, unless they really get good, to see a deteriorating investment climate, capital flight, and ultimately, inflation. This is not good for having a robust economy that can develop balancing military capabilities. Third, one must also acknowledge the United States has the healthiest economy in the world among the great industrial powers. Now, that's not to say we're good, but it's healthier than every other country. Healthier in Japan, healthier in China, healthier in Germany or France. Korea looks good. But the United States is doing pretty good, despite our debt. Technology. Can China innovate on technology to make advanced weaponry? We don't know. They still can't make defense engines, jet engines. They buy them from Russia. You want to make a civilian aircraft. They're building civilian aircraft now. But they're not building engines for them. They're importing them. That's not a good way to live. Imagine the war starts. You lose half your planes. You want more. What do? You go ask Russia for more? That's not, could you sell us more planes? That's not where you want to be. What you want to be is we're going to crank up production because it's wartime. But you can't crank up production because you can't make the engines. China's still a assembly plant. An American advantage seems to be in high technology innovation. I don't know how China will balance its multiple military priorities. Much of China's naval capabilities will depend on domestic instability and how bad it is, whether the PLA has to be used for domestic purposes. How about borders? Unstable borders with minorities and religious groups surrounding China. Can you count on Russia in 30 years to be where it is today? Probably, but I don't know. Will there be enough funding to compete if the economy slows down? I don't know. And finally, the United States has a real big head start. And we're really nervous about China. So we combine our head start with being really nervous about China, that we're never losing our attention. And we're doing everything to keep our edge. And that will make it difficult for China. So, to conclude, America is dependent on divided regions since 1776, and we still do. And we don't worry much about Europe because the Russians are still pretty weak. But we worry about Asia because of the rise of China. And in many respects, China looks a lot more dangerous than Russia ever did. This is a real economy right now. But given how important our interests are, one would expect to do a lot. And we're doing a lot. So anyone who says the pivot isn't working, they're lying to you. Don't ask, is the president going to visit Asia? No one cares about headline writers. Is Secretary of State Kerry going to attend the ASEAN meeting? No one cares except the president wants his picture taken, or the foreign minister wants his picture taken with the American Secretary of State. Countries that care don't focus on presidential visits or summits. They look at the same things that Taiwan and South Korea looked at. What's happening in power relations? And if you're Southeast Asia, you're still pretty confident, regardless of rumors about the pivot, that America's doing what it needs to do.
Thank you very much, Professor Ross.